Welcome to the Tech Humanist Show, a multimedia format program exploring how data and technology shape the human experience. I'm your host, Kate O'Neill.
Once we use AI to remove existing processes and do existing things we want to do, and it releases us, give us more time, what do we want to use that time for?
James Taylor is one of those rare people who lives at the intersection of creativity, performance, and real-world execution. He delivers an astonishing number of keynotes around the world, and he's the author of Super Creativity, a new book on accelerating innovation in the age of AI. In this conversation, we focus on what AI is making possible for creators and leaders, how James uses it in his own process, and what boundaries matter if you want more creative to also mean more human. Hey, James Taylor, it's so good to see you. Thank you for joining us on the Tech Humanist Show.
Well, it's great to be with you. I always love hanging out with you because you're always so bright and smiley and optimistic. It's great. I'm really looking forward to this conversation today.
Me too. And I'm really excited because your book just came out, right? In January, is it?
It came out just 3rd of March was the hardback and the print date, and then the audiobook's going to be coming out in a few weeks' time.
Oh, okay, great. We're in exactly the right time frame for this. Perfect. So tell us about Super Creativity is the book, right? What's the subtitle?
Subtitle is Accelerating Innovation in the Age of Artificial Intelligence. I'm kind of leaning into the fact that innovation is like a term that's kind of declining at the moment. It's because all the lifeblood is getting sucked out of it by artificial intelligence. But so it's really intended for people who are interested, like creativity, innovation, AI. These are the three topics that I speak on anyway, and I kind of wanted to put them together in one book. So whether someone's coming more from the traditional kind of the more creative side of things, or a little bit more from the innovation, or more from the AI and the tech side, they're going to find something valuable in the book.
What's the simplest definition of super creativity that you could give our listeners?
So super creativity is simply how we augment our human creativity that we're born with by collaborating more deeply with other people or machines. So whether that's artificial intelligence or robotics. So super creativity, as biggest conception, is really about how we really unlock that creative potential within each of us by just working much more collaboratively with other people and machines. That's the core of what the book is really about. And in the book, I kind of break it down into these 3 sections of the book, which is kind of human creativity, individual creativity, which is how we develop the creativity within ourselves. So let's talk about the creative process. Then we talk about the human and human. So that's about how we use things like creative pairs, how we build very creative and collaborative teams in organizations, create a sense of psychological safety. And then the bit that I'm often speaking most about just now is the human plus the machine. So it's the human plus AI side. I do a little bit in the robotics, but it's primarily around the human and AI piece I'm talking about there.
Now, you've been talking about this kind of overall theme for a while now. What was the aha moment that made you think, like, this is the time for this book to be written?
I was, so before I got into the stuff that I do today as a keynote speaker, and even before I worked in the Bay Area and tech, like you did as well, you worked in that world, I used to manage high-profile rock stars. So I worked with members of the Rolling Stones, multiple Grammy Award winners. And I talk about this in the book. I remember standing there at the side of the stage at London's Royal Albert Hall, which is this very famous venue in London. And I had one of my artists that was performing. And so I'm standing there at the side of the stage, and I'm watching that artist, and the spotlight is on them. There's 5,000 people in the audience, like going wild, just really enjoying the show. And then I looked slightly to my right, which is where the audience can't see. And I look at those 100, 200 people that are working backstage, out of sight, who are just as much a part of making a creative and successful and innovative show as the person with the spotlight on them. So what I really wanted to do is I kind of had that aha moment. I've been working with lots of music artists, big ego people for many, many years. And I wanted to highlight those backstage heroes that we have in organizations. In the US, you have this term like the hidden figures that we have in so many organizations who often don't get the credit. They often don't have the word creative in their job title, or they're in a department within the business is not necessarily thought of as the creative part. And I wanted to unlock their potential. That's kind of what I want to. And I love it if people from the traditional creative industries read the book, from the arts, entertainment. That's great. but that's not who the book is primarily written for. If you want books like that, you could people like Seth Godin's brilliant in writing books like that. I wanted to go for the 99%, the people that don't necessarily consider themselves that creative.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I wonder though, as you think about the AI integration with this topic, what it enables for human beings. Like, what's one example where you've seen AI genuinely expand, the range of ideas, not just speed to idea?
Yeah, I mean, I think you see it. I mean, I have a lot of clients within luxury goods, for example. You look at brands like Jacquemus, they're doing they're doing amazing, cool things in terms of campaigns. So this on that side. But then I also work with companies like Micron, who make high bandwidth memory for these big data centers that exist in the world, and they've actually replaced 95% of the work that goes into their procurement with artificial intelligence, agentic AI, to do many of those things. Then that is releasing the people within the organization to do kind of slightly higher quality work and augmenting that. And where I see some of it going is part of it is internally in organizations is about what we call creating these kind of centaurs or cyborgs way of working. So where that individual uses AI a bit like a guitar player has a guitar, where it becomes like part of who they are. They're constantly refining and molding its responses. It becomes just kind of part of the way that they work. Whereas the kind of centaurs, kind of going back to like the Gary Kasparovs, when they got beaten by IBM, that's more when you're looking at a piece of work or a project and you're saying to yourself and your team, okay, these are the things that we're going to use AI for, and these are things that myself and my human team will do. So that's part of it. And if we take the next few logical steps, and I remember I thought, do I write about this in the book? And I thought, no, it's going to maybe push it a little bit too far. I left it out of the book, and I should have maybe put it in, where a friend of mine called Elaine Pofeld, who's a wonderful writer for Forbes, who wrote a book a few years ago, she kindly featured me in it, which is called The $1 Million One-Person Business, of businesses that do over $1 million in revenue, but there's only one employee in that business. In America, there's lots and lots of these. And I remember saying to her at the time, I think we're thinking too small here. I think we're going to be looking at the $1 billion one-person business very soon. And I had this conversation with her, and I thought, do I talk about it in the book? Because especially with things like agentic AI, you're starting to see that. And then only last month, what happened is the first $1 billion one-person business was created by Claude bot, Maltbot, whatever you decide to call it, sold to OpenAI for a reported $10 billion, $1 billion in cash, $9 billion in equity. And so that was a business started and built in 4 months. And I thought, imagine what we can do as that individual to build those kind of one-person $1 billion businesses by combining that creativity and AI. But it still kind of goes back to the questions, and what kind of future do you want to create? What do you want to create? And so in the book, I talk about these different P's, within the book, and part of that is this idea of like purpose. I had a guest on my own podcast, Super Creativity podcast, a while ago, who's a bioethicist, a wonderful bioethicist from Canada. And we were talking about a lot of tech bros and how they're doing kind of strange things in terms of genetic modification of children. And she said this thing, and it really can hit home to me as well, is like thinking about what kind of future do we want to create? Because we get to decide. And I think so much of, and you must see it with your clients, where they kind of get caught up in the bright, shiny thing syndrome, and they fail just to take a pause a little bit and to ask the question, what kind of future do we want to create? Where do we want to go? And I hope that's the conversation starts to move to that, and we think about the ethical implications, which I know is the area that you speak a lot about as well. We're probably not quite there at the moment. I think probably something needs to happen that shocks people a little bit more to kind of thinking like the why are we doing this?
Yeah. Thank you for saying that. It's so important. That's basically a future so bright and what matters next rolled into one, and very important to the body of work that I've built. So glad to hear that you think that it's the direction that needs to go and that maybe is going. I wonder though, when you think about using these tools as a creativity unlock, where do you see that most happening today, or that the biggest opportunity is it in the solo creators, or is it in teams or executives? You talk about the possibility of a $1 billion one person business, but when we think about what that means in terms of the potential for teams and executives of larger corporations, it's obviously, even more potentially amazing. So where do you
Yeah.
see that potential?
I mean, at the moment, a lot of the use cases that get talked about a lot, and where you're seeing a lot of people leaning in is like the augmented coding.
Mhm.
So that's a big part. But actually, that is interesting, and I speak to a lot of companies that that's kind of the work that they do, and that this is an organization, and they're maybe 40% of the code is now being written by AI, and that's great, and that's kind of interesting. But actually, that industry or that part of industry is quite small. I'm almost a little bit more excited about where we go with things like healthcare, which have a much bigger percentage of the GDP of countries, and actually have the biggest productivity gains. And for me, some of this is personal. I have a lot of pharmaceutical and medical devices companies, and I think about my local hospital in the UK, and I talk to some of the nurses on those wards, and they say 40% of their time on that ward is spent filling in forms. And I thought, what a huge waste of the
Mhm.
potential of those individuals. And so I think we're going through this first wave, which is they're just, they're building, many of these people are building things to scratch their own itch, which is great, which is fantastic. They're building stuff for coders and geeks and tech, so that's fine. Where we need to go next is all those other industries,
Mhm.
those other job titles that they can be improved upon, and so that's where I'm really excited. And there's that famous infographic that's going around just now, which is not entirely true, where they kind of show the dots, like what percentage of people are actually using AI just now.
Mhm.
And it's like three dots. It's like a very
Mhm.
small. And so I think most of the people that you and I speak to, they're leaders. They're using these tools day in, day out.
Mhm.
And what they're really thinking about is, first of all, how's it going to change the work I do to the individual piece? How is it going to change the composition of our organization? Are we going to move from a traditional triangle shape to something else, a diamond shape or something else? And then once we use AI to remove existing processes and do existing things we want to do, and it releases us, give us more time, what do we want to use that time for? And I think this is where I want to kind of step in with the book, is saying, okay, there'll be AI will be used for taking away a lot of the mundane things we do. That's great, that's wonderful, but this releases us to focus on what do we want to create next,
Mhm.
what is something that we possibly can't even imagine right now. And then that comes back to the creativity bit. I know people like Sam Altman, they're not flavor of the month just now, but I saw him talking a little while ago when he talked about what are going to be the most important skills for this time. And he talked about creativity and critical thinking, because it's still going to require us to ask the question, what do we want to create? What do we want to build? And I think for many products, we also like the fact that we know that another human has built that or has been involved in building that product, whether that's in music or mugs or whatever the thing the thing may be. So that's kind of where I'm most excited, and we can maybe I can talk to you, give you a very simple example about how I use AI, the way that I
Yeah.
use this kind of super creativity. You and I, we have quite similar jobs. What we
Mhm.
do is we go on stages and we hopefully inspire people, but we also want to create a transformation in the room. Because if we're not creating a transformation, then we're just entertainers, and I don't want to just be we don't want to be just entertainers. So the way that I use AI, and that kind of more kind of super creative human plus machine way of working, is if a client brings me to speak at one of their conferences, the first thing I do all the usual things that we do as speakers. We do pre-event calls and we ask them like who the audience is and what's important to them. But then I ask them, can you also give me the details of the people that will be attending? I then use AI to create the psychometric profiles of the room. So this tells me a sense of like, how does this room think? How do they feel? Are they want to go a little bit more on data? Are they going to work a bit more on storytelling? I think then do first drafts of my presentation. I can then overlay the psychometrics of my presentation, the psychometrics of the audience, and I can see where the gaps are. So for example, I did one the other day where even if you're not giving presentations like we are, if you're going in to pitch someone on a business idea, for example, this is one of the simplest things that you can do just to understand the psychometrics of the people that you're trying to convince. And I was doing one the other day, a pitch to a CEO in New York, and I did this, and I had an email correspondence with them. I sent. He had some articles for trade magazines he'd written. I used some AI tools to be able to give me a sense of who this person was. And I could immediately see this is someone that's much more gregarious than me. Big, bold, you know? So when I get on that call with him, I'm going to change my posture a little bit in order to connect with him. Now, for him, it's going to feel like, wow, this James Taylor, this guy, he really connects with me. He really understands where I'm coming from. But it's data I'm using to inform that decision as well. And so now,
but you know, just to interrupt you, just
Yeah.
to say, like, it's data-informed empathy, though, right? Like, you're actually
Absolutely.
humanly using the data in a way that only a human can in that
It
context,
is the blend.
right?
It is the blend. That's where the art piece comes into what we do and having that conversation. We've all probably been in those rooms with salespeople. Maybe you're going buying a car or something, and they've learned a bunch of tricks, like sales type tricks, and you go into them and you kind of go, "Oh, this feels like really horrible." They're kind of
Right.
doing all the the same things like the matching and all that stuff that the 1980s sales things happen, and that's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is really getting a very deep understanding of that person you're connecting with. And if we think about it from an organizational standpoint, I was just doing an event recently in Atlanta, and I was talking with an executive from Siemens there. And what she was describing is what she's done is she's created a digital twin of her boss. So in advance of giving a pitch or presentation to her boss, she runs it through the digital twin of her boss first. It then anticipates the question that her boss is likely to ask her. She's going to then put that into the presentation. So when she meets with that boss, it's going to be a much higher level kind of conversation. They can get to the more human parts a little bit quicker because they don't have to deal with some of the more mundane things.
That is so great. I love the digital twin of the boss. I mean, I think a lot of people are doing this in loose ways by saying, like, by telling ChatGPT or whatever LLM they like to use, act as a whatever, act as my boss is in this role, and that sort of thing. But it is interesting to imagine even more structure to that process.
And also there's as we know, a lot of these any of the platforms, some of them are quite sycophantic in the way that they respond to you. And it's like, I remember when things like Alexa first came out, they would say things like, if you say that's not right, you say, "Oh, I'm sorry, I'll try to do better." There's like all that thing, and that's been set up in such a way. And when I work with any of the LLMs, I actually like to go and set it up in such a way that it talks to me a little bit more like a New York cab driver, and it pushes back on my ideas. It pushes back because I talk about in the book creative abrasion. I don't want just someone to say, James, that's a brilliant idea. That's a really great idea. I don't want that. If I wanted a bunch of yes men, you could build a bunch of yes AIs if you wanted that to make your ego feel better. For me, for creativity, that doesn't help me. What I like to do is I like to build almost a virtual board of mentors or a mastermind coming from slightly different perspectives, and I triangulate based upon that, and I use my human judgment to understand, okay, this is how Satya Nadella would think about this problem. This is how Warren Buffett would think about this problem. This is how Mary Barra would think about this problem. And then I put myself into it and my own taste and my own sense of judgment, my own opinions, and I kind of form a final judgment from it.
What do you never use AI for, even if you could do it passively?
What do I never use AI for? I tend not to use it like Google, probably. I know a lot of people, they find it very useful to use it like Google. I actually use Google like it is now because Google's got so much better at understanding that, so I don't have to do that anymore. There's certain things that I still like on the writing, for example. It hasn't quite got to the level where I feel I like to use it as an editor, as a sounding board on things, but I don't really, even though it has a lot of my writing, it can understand a little bit of my voice, I'm still very cautious about using it for that. Because I think part of the role of writing, and you and I we've both written books now, is that part of that role of writing is not just getting something out into the world, it's getting us to use our thinking to arrive and to clarify what we think. And art is like that as well. You're kind of often using art for that. And so I think by just going the easy option and just saying, hey, just write me an article about this or whatever, I think that's doing ourselves a disservice. And we already see it just now in surgeons are using things like robotic surgery. They're getting a little bit of atrophy in some of their skills, and I don't want to get that atrophy in some of the skills that make me me.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a fantastic example that the skill atrophy is something that I think has been a real discussion. Has that come up in the discussions you have with your clients about how they're thinking organizationally about skill atrophy?
Yeah, it comes in. It's interesting when it comes up. It comes up when I speak to a lot of law firms, global law firms, and they worry about younger generations coming through who don't have the same critical thinking skills as they do. And I'm not necessarily saying that's right. I agree with that statement, but a lot of them feel that
But the
is
concern is there.
that's concern is there, and they're saying, listen, if they're not in the room, then and they're not hearing these conversations, then they're not going to develop these skills. And this is like the out of office kind of working and virtual working as well. So I hear that a little bit about that type of skills. But yet, when I often I find those boomers, the older generation, they can be some of the worst culprits in getting very lazy on these things. I mean, many of these devices, people like Steve Jobs, when he created some of these devices at Apple, I genuinely think he wanted to create tools of creativity, and I don't think many of these tools operate like that. I think they're tools of consumption, not of creativity. I was in a wonderful restaurant just the other day. I talk about it in the book. Actually, it's called Gautier. It's a French vegan plant-based restaurant in London. Brilliant. Do
I haven't
vegan
gotten a
caviar.
chance to go yet. I know you flagged it to me in the
It's
past.
amazing. And so I was in there the other day, and I wanted to give a copy to Alexis, who's who created the restaurant, and also Alexia, who's the head chef of the one in London. And we were talking, just having this conversation about mise en place. This idea that you have everything within a space around you that you can operate the tools that you need to work. And I think one of the dangers of having like mobile phones and different devices is because they're always within the arm's length, they're easy to kind of go to and use in certain kind of ways. And I think people like Atomic Habits, like James Clear, kind of talks about this in certain ways about moving things out of your line of sight, or where someone told me, and I don't know if it's true, so don't take me for this, for it's being true, but someone said to me, every time you have a device next to you, your IQ level decreases by about 10%. I don't know if that's true. It sounds like it could be true. It'd be nice to be true, but I definitely think it does something to our minds in terms of like, do you have a physical environment around you that supports what you're doing as well? This idea of mise en place.
Yeah, no, that's really important. I think recognizing that even if it's not literally 10 points of IQ, that your attention is a little bit distracted. It's a little bit going to whatever your
Yeah,
surroundings are. Let's
yeah,
talk about the values question around this, because clearly, AI models these days, large language models and agentic that's built upon that have all been trained on volumes of data that was human generated, most of which has not been compensated, most of which violates the spirit, at least, if not the law of copyright and IP. What's your take on this, and what seems fair to you as a model going forward? Are you thinking much about how these things can make sort of a remedial pass at compensating or giving consent or giving permission or credit to
yeah.
sources?
It's funny, Alison, my wife, and I, we created she's a lawyer and engineer to trade, and she thinks very differently to me, and she's a singer as well, so she's got very different life experiences to me. And we created a keynote program called the Ethical Futurists, which kind of talks about this. So she comes at it from a more earth systems, a more human way. I come at it a little bit more from the technology systems way of thinking. And we have this program where we go on stage and we talk about it. And I thought, this is going to be great. People are going to love this. And it's called the Ethical Futurists. So ethical futurism, what does an ethical future look like? Values, like all those things. It's one of the hardest sells
Yeah.
to sell to clients. And if you look at so many organizations today and you ask them what are the values of the organization, and they'll say ethics, having a good ethical framework. And then you ask them the question, when was the last time you brought in speakers to talk about ethics or values in organizations? It goes quiet. So I have my own personal views on where I see things end up, which is is kind of out there maybe, but is I believe the individual should be sovereign over their own data. And then I should give other organizations, hospitals, whatever, access to that data for a certain amount of time, for a certain usage, and that should come back to me. That's an ideal world, but we don't live in an ideal world. So that's what I would like to see, that individual being sovereign over that data. We're not there. Also, the other thing that we're seeing just now is like sovereign AI coming up with a lot of different places where most of these models have been trained in a very West Coast US kind of way of looking at the world. And I work with a lot of clients in the Middle East and Saudi Arabia and UAE, and they're building up their own models like Falcon, for example, in the UAE, which reflect a little bit more of them. In fact, I just spoke for the one of the tribal nations in America and a kind of Ohio type of area. And they're really thinking about this as well, because a few hundred years ago, they got their land taken from them. And they don't want to suffer the same thing again. They want to have that ownership, that people to have this ownership to reflect their values and what they're doing as well. So I think it's a big issue. I have personal preferences, things that I would like to see in the world. I don't feel that it's going there. I feel, if you speak to many leaders today and you have that private conversation with them off of a stage, and I say, where do you really want to use these tools? They're often talking about it in terms of reducing headcount in the organization. Like, how can I get rid of, there was the Jack Dorsey, getting rid of 40% of, the employees in the organization. And I think you're going to go through that because that's what the markets kind of want a little bit just now, the productivity piece. But that's only going to take you so far. We still need people to actually make a living, to buy the products, to buy the services that we create as well. What happens there? Universal basic income, really interesting, but it has some issues with it. Universal, basic, so it's really a super complicated area. And I talk to clients and I say, did you want me to talk about this in the keynotes, like the ethical implications? And most of them say, no, we'd rather you didn't speak about it. It's kind of rare that they're actually willing to want to have that conversation on a stage. It comes up in the Q&As. You probably find this on the panels. It's like one of the first questions that often comes up is the ethical implications of these technologies. But often the clients don't necessarily want it to be the thrust, certainly, of a keynote.
Yeah, well, obviously, I think your positioning and mine are pretty different in that sense, where I'm being brought in for those conversations. But interesting that you're finding that pushback. I wonder, though, if just one last thought on that, if you could implement one practical norm tomorrow, like consent or compensation, attribution, disclosure, provenance, whatever, what would it be? What would you most prioritize?
It would probably be about the next technology which is going to dominate, which is, I just spoke at an eye care industry conference in Orlando, and with the new Meta glasses and the new generation that's going on there now, in terms of how they're connected to facial recognition and CRM systems. In the US, you don't have a federal law, AI law. In EU, we have an AI Act, which prohibits some of those things. I know in the US, California is leading a bit further, and other states are leading at that. I'm very worried about that. In fact, I just read a story today about a woman that went into her local grocery store, and the security officer immediately came up to her and wanted to eject her from the place. They said, because we saw you steal some meat products yesterday. And she went, I wasn't even in the store yesterday. And they looked back at the video recording. The AI thought they'd recognized her, but it wasn't her. And so you can see that happening in lots of different places. And so now you imagine the new generation of smart glasses, like that fighter pilot. It gives me information on what am I looking at, who am I looking at. Someone comes into my car showroom, it's immediately telling me this person has a higher credit rating than this person. That's what I would look to change, to put some guardrails around that, because the mobile phone, this technology is kind of going to go away, and it's not going to be the thing that we have in our pocket, but the thing that we wear on our heads. And I know Harvard have done some stuff recently, and kind of really shocking about how you can break those glasses to give you those kind of superpowers. The military has been doing this for a number of years now in terms of how they think about this, and I'm kind of worried about that. That's kind of where I would go, and maybe a little bit on the bioterrorism side, which is another area that I kind of worry about.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's a helpful perspective to hear from you, since you do think about this, and just to think about, what are the pieces that aren't at odds with, creativity and the creative uses of AI. So taking it back to that, though, you are someone who does what, 50 to 100 keynotes a year? What is your pace? Is that about right?
Yeah, about 50 to 100 keynotes a year, 25 plus countries. I think it's about 270,000 miles last year. So I love speaking on global stages. I like speaking where the audience is a mix. They're coming from different places. I like my keynotes to be representative of audiences and have different perspectives. I worry that the area of deglobalization that we're in just now is where people will only start to share stories from their region or their part of the world. And I think we can learn so much from other parts of the world, how they think about some of these things. And so I like sharing those global stories and global perspectives.
That's lovely. So let me talk about what does it take to stay original at that pace, and how much of the machine of that do you use AI for, and how much do you hope you can use AI for to take the stuff off your plate going forward?
Yeah, I mean, I use AI and basically the way like kind of Centaur process, like guitarist. I use it in everything that I do. It kind of weaves its way, and my team use it for everything that they do as well. I mean, I think about my assistant Dottie, and he does the work of 3 people now, probably. And how he uses it, and he understands using different tools for different types of things that he's trying to do as well. So that's kind of how I tend to kind of work. I just see it as an extension of what I'm trying to do. I don't really. It's just something that I have. It's just kind of part of my day to day, and I don't get overly kind of worried about it in terms of how I stay on top of the topics. As you know, I receive. I think we did the calculation, like something like 500 inquiries a year to speak, and so but I only do between 50 to 100. So the vast majority, I say no to, but most of those calls I actually do discovery calls with those people. So I treat discovery calls. Yes, I am going to share with them like why I think I could potentially be a good speaker for their event, but I'm also using it to learn, because I get to learn about their industry, what their challenges are just now. Some industries are a bit further ahead than other industries. I can see I'm a very good pattern recognizer at spotting patterns across different industries. If you look at a lot of people who often have innovations, they're what we call boundary crossers. So my core is in understanding one particular topic around creativity, but I'm pulling from other different topics, other areas, and then relating it to those things as well, whether that's biomimicry or whatever the thing may be. So for me, having those conversations with clients is wonderful, because and this is maybe the other thing, talking about the human AI piece. In addition to using the AI tools to understand the client and the audience, I also try and speak to 2 to 3 audience members in advance of the event. And what I'm listening for is what their 2 a.m. problems are. And they tell me things that give me a little bit more texture on the industry. So when I relay those in different ways to the audience immediately sense it is relevant. No one wants to speak it. It just feels like a canned speech. They want someone that feels relevant to them, that have really understood them. And sometimes that's by putting a very simple phrase in that gets used in their industry, that it's like a little nod to them, like, there's things like that as well. But I love learning. And so I think if you are a lover of learning and curiosity, doing what you and I do, it is the best job in the world, because we're getting an MBA in different topics every single month.
Yeah, which is a form of super creativity, right? And I'm thinking that seems like such a great sort of case study in super creativity as lived and applied by you, James Taylor.
Yeah. And also the other thing is that when we go to these events, if we're lucky enough, I mean, I'm normally kind of flying in the night before, do the event, fly out, leave that day. But sometimes I get a chance to hear most of the times I get to hear the other speakers. And actually, sometimes it's not necessarily the other professional speakers like you and I. It's superior domain people with great domain expertise. So I did an event in Istanbul for an oil and gas company last month, and there was a guy speaking there who had written a book all about the African market, how you sell to the African consumer. And he said something very simple, which was, he said, for many Nigerian homes, when you go into a Nigerian home through the kitchen. So they tend to put the higher quality white goods and products in the kitchen, where we tend to put them in like the living room areas, like our TVs and things like that as well. And just those little nuances, little simple, like, oh, okay, so that makes you think differently. So as well as learning from our clients, we also get to learn from the other speakers that are on the stages.
Yeah, that's such a great point. Every event that I go to where they have a pre-morning keynote, or not like a not quite keynote, but a pre program sort of speaker who's like an economist or someone who's brought in from the media to give kind of a current state of affairs. Those are always the best speakers.
Yeah.
It is fascinating to hear those people because they're so good at contextualizing so much, like bringing this really big picture together and
Yeah.
synthesizing that.
I mean, and that's what's great about books. I mean, if you think about it, it's, when you read that book, you were talking about writing a 70,000 word book recently.
Yeah.
This is like 40,000 words, not quite as big as your book, but that is a condensation of years and years of study and thought and conversation and workshopping. And a book costs like $25 or something. It's like the highest value per hour spent. Maybe the games industry is a little bit higher, let's say, but the book is pretty high in terms of what you get from that book. And obviously we're seeing a little bit decrease in reading just now. And a lot of people are saying to me, like, when's the audiobook going to come out? Because that's what many of us listen, through audiobooks instead of actually reading. But whichever way you get it, these are pretty powerful little information devices, I guess.
Absolutely, they are. All right, so if somebody wants to be super creative, like this month, and wants to sort of reform their approach to do that, you already talked about, James Clear, Atomic Habits, and the idea of, keeping your phone away, setting up your space, creating that environment. What are some other things that people can keep in mind that may have to do with AI or may have to do, with how they relate to other humans or their environment?
Yeah, so I mean, one of the I talk a lot about curiosity. So I believe curiosity is the fuel for creativity, and which then drives innovation from that as well. So I think a lot of it is just about kind of reawakening that curiosity that we're born with. And it's sad, if I go and speak in a room, often I'll ask how many people in the room consider themselves to be creative or good creative thinkers. In the US, it's going to be a little bit higher, maybe 40%. If I'm speaking in South Korea, it's going to be 10%. So I think job number one is to reignite that curiosity. And there's different ways of doing that. So, I mean, very simple. I'll go and, if I'm in an airport, I'll go and pick up a magazine in an industry I know nothing about, or a topic I know nothing about, just so I can get some random inputs from that as well. The other thing I really like to do is I like to do, at West Point Military School, they teach a technique called preloading, which is 2 hours before you go to sleep at night. Get used to asking yourself an open-ended question. Like, what is the one thing I can do to improve on this? What is the one thing I can do? And in the book, I talk about these 5 stages of the creative process. And this is basically what you're doing is you're doing the preparation and the incubation stage. So what you're doing is you're incubating that idea overnight. And in the morning, basically your brain is fuzzy, it's unwound, you're open to unconventional thoughts. Alpha waves are rippling through your brain, directing your attention inwards to remote associations that emanate from the right hemisphere. Also, that part of the brain that says that's a stupid idea, that hasn't woken up yet, which is why we get so many great ideas. People that can switch that off, comedians can switch that part of the brain off. Jazz improvisers can switch that part of the brain off. But for many of us, in the morning is when that's kind of switched off naturally as well. So that's just a very simple. And then probably the third one I would talk about is as well as process, and I talk about this in the book, like place. We call this idea of a third place. Someone that's not your desk at home, but also, or work, but also not your home. It's a kind of middle place. 2,000 years ago, we had something called symposiums, and the Greeks had. The word symposium just means to drink together, because the Greeks knew a few glasses of wine was quite conducive to the creative process. So I'm a big proponent of like just changing your physical place, the space that you're in, and how that affects you. I had a great guest on the show on my podcast recently called Joseph Gibelli, Dr. Joseph Gibelli, who wrote a wonderful book called The Brain at Rest. And in the book, he explains why being in nature, going for that walk in Central Park, let's say where you are, how that triggers parts of the brain that allows us to go into that deep state. And also the other thing that happens is trees, they let off these chemicals called phytoncides, which do interesting things to the brain. If you know anything about the worldwide wood, let's say when a tree in a corner of a woodland gets sick, all the other trees send signals and nutrients through the root system to that tree to help that tree. And we are part of nature. is part of who we are. So we want to use all of that. Ideas don't just come from us inside. It's not an ego-driven thing. It comes from all around us. In fact, the Romans had a term for it called the genius loci. This idea that places themselves can have their own creative genius. So use that place. Where is those places that ideas come to you more naturally, and try and just spend a little bit more time in those places.
Brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. I know everybody's going to want to get a copy of this book. Show us the book one more time. Super Creativity. There it is. You're going to be doing the audiobook this weekend, right? It's going to be available.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
maybe by the time this episode comes out.
If it goes really badly, I may just get an AI to voice it for me. So you're going to have to wait for a month to see how it turns out first.
Green apple slices. You'll be fine. James Taylor, where can people find out about you?
If they go to my website, jamestaylor.me, that's the best place. They can go and find podcasts. They can find loads of free resources as well, and links to the book.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us today and for challenging us to be more super creative and for bringing such great examples. Thank you.
Thank you for having me guest on the show. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to The Tech Humanist Show. This episode was produced and edited by Thrive Loud Productions, with research by Ashley Robinson and Aaron Daughtry of Interrobang. You can find more information about the show's guests and links to their projects at thetechhumanist.com, where you can also find more episodes, or you can subscribe at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Special thanks to all of our guests for lending their voices to help make the future a brighter place. I'm Kate O'Neill. You've been listening to The Tech Humanist Show from KO Insights.